If you've ever read a fairy tale, there's often a line that says, and they all lived happily ever after. Have you ever wished that for your life? Today on Find the Way, we want to explore what happily ever after looks like. Hi, I'm Ashley Sherbino, and I want to welcome you to Find the Way with speaker and host, Dr. Mike Sherbino. Mike will be unpacking this truth from the final chapter in the fairy tale story of the life of Ruth. And then our special guest, Dr. John Radford, he's going to help us delve into this subject from his professional world as a crisis and conflict intervention specialist.
Hey, Ashley, we're glad to welcome all our guests today, and you too, John. We'll just say welcome again. Looking forward to the show as we talk about happily ever after. That's kind of where we want to live, isn't it? And but as we get into the subject today, and we are going to take a lot of time to get into this today, we want to listen to a song that really focuses on the end of Ruth. It talks about the kinsman redeemer. We're going to explain that word later on, but it's a reference to Jesus who is mighty to save. Let's listen to Hillsong right now as they sing about that, a song called Mighty to Save.
A love that's never failing, but let mercy fall on me. Where everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of the Savior, the hope of the nation. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. But he rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. As you find me, all my fears and failures, and fill my life again. I give my life to Father, everything I believe in, and now I surrender. I surrender.
To Find the Way. You can find us online at findtheway.faith. I'm here in the studio with Dr. Mike Sherbino and Dr. John Radford. That's a lot of doctors around me.
Yeah,
it's too many.
A lot of doctors, no nurses, and none of us know how to stick on a Band-Aid. But anyways, my name's Mike, this is John, and you're Ashley. And we just want to live happily ever after. John, here's a quick one. Why do we always live with that thought, oh, if I could only live happily ever after?
Because somehow we have this expectation, right, in life that if we can just be in life and live in a way that meets our own expectations of how this is all going to work, and that's kind of key to seeing success for self.
And I think there's another aspect tied in with that we just want to be able to tuck in all the corners of the bed to make things neat and tidy. And so we come to Ruth today in just a moment, and God does a miracle where he pulls things together. But oftentimes it's not the way that we expect or wish. And sometimes we just get frustrated, don't we, when God doesn't move on our schedule. Have you ever noticed that?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely a problem, right? We have, coming back to the expectation of the way things should work out and the way that they should look. And we see this in relation to God. We see this, though, just in society as well. There's a belief that things should go the way I planned and the way I want. So.
And most often they don't. And there's the challenge. And there's the tension between what I expect to be happening or to happen and what's really going on for me right now. And it seems then that life gets too complicated. I thought it was going to be simple. I thought this is how it's going to work. And suddenly find it's a whole lot more complex than I realized. And that kind of plays on our mind, right?
So I want to take a few minutes right now, and I want to unpack the final chapter of the book of Ruth. If people are listening in, they can read that chapter. It's Ruth chapter 4. It's an amazing story. It happens 2 grandparents away from when David is actually born to be the next king of Israel. So as you begin to think through that whole sequence, it's way back when. But let me pause by telling you a story. Maybe this helps us with the happily ever after. But little Susie was a grade school girl in about grade 3 or 4, and she comes home with wide-eyed and breathless excitement. And she talks to her mom, and she's had for the first time had heard the story of Prince Charming and Sleeping Beauty. And she says, Mom, she says, you know, Sleeping Beauty was there, and Prince Charming comes and kisses her rather, and she wakes up, and guess what happened next? And the mother said, well, I know, they lived happily ever after. And little Susie, with an expression all over her face, says, no, Mom, that's not what happened at all. They got married. And so we kind of pause, and we go there, and we say, wow, what's happily ever after look like? And maybe little Susie had a better grasp on life than we as adults often want to admit. But the problem is that we live in a world filled with paradox. And while we want the simple, we buy the complicated. And life is complicated. From being politically correct to trying to show sensitivity to people in their situation. And the tension is that we often look for a formula that we can plug in and hope it will work. And even in the church, we've been guilty of trying to give trite answers to people who are in incredible pain. And we're going to unpack some of that today. We want the doctor to give us a prescription, and then we'll be frustrated if the illness isn't gone in 10 days. Or we go to the mechanic and say, when will my car be ready? And we have a conniption if it takes an extra day. And then he'll give us an estimate, and we'll say, okay, but what we want is to desperately be in control of our lives and of our time and resources. It's drilled into us as children. Work hard, save up for university, and then get an education. And when you get an education, then you can get a job. And then you can be secure, and then you can have a family. And the problem with all of this is that our generation simply hasn't bought into it. And we're disillusioned. And we're saying there has to be something more. We come to the book of Ruth, and we see that what happened, and we're going back now 4 weeks ago, we had a father and a mother. They were facing a famine, and they decided they were going to do something that God said not to do. They're going to go to another country, the land of Moab, and they were going to go down there and try to carve out an existence. God said no. There was a problem that was in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, which was interesting, the house of bread, and yet there was famine everywhere. But they decide to not address the inner issues of why the famine was there. It was part of God's judgment and calling people back to him, saying, hey, get right with me, and there'll be blessing in your lives. And that's a whole other tension we need to explore later on in the show. If I do this, this, and this, is God promising he's going to do this and that in our lives? Because we get very disillusioned when God doesn't show up at the right time. But Naomi and Elimelech, they go to Moab, and you remember the story, their 2 sons, they end up dying there, and now Naomi is coming back with her one daughter-in-law, Ruth. She doesn't know what to do, but 10 years later, she's saying, I'm going to start to go back. And I want to suggest today that if we want to live happily ever after, and we're going to define that even more as the show goes on, but if we want to know God's best in our lives right now, and life feels like it's a mess, here it is. When your back is up against the wall, hold out your hand for a miracle. One of the things that I believe very strongly is that God has miraculous power, and he wants to intervene in your life. It might not mean that he's going to give you the lottery, but I do believe that he will give you and I the grace to persevere through difficult times. But maybe a question we need to ask that comes out of the context of the story of Ruth is, why is it that we wait until we come to the end of ourselves and then turn to God? Probably more than at any time, it's when our back is up against the wall that we realize we need someone greater than ourselves, and that is Jesus. And you could be in that situation today. But often we just want Jesus in little bits. You know, Lord, get me out of this mess and I'll follow you. But don't mind if I don't get too radical. And so if that's our mentality, we'll always be on the fringe looking in, wondering what it would be like to surrender all. Many of our listeners are people who've given up on church or given up on God. But he wants you to still know his miraculous power in your life today. And I believe it happens when we simply keep our eyes focused on Jesus and say, Lord, I'm prepared to surrender. I'm prepared to follow. But when you're in a mess, what do? Well, I suggest the first thing is resist the urge to panic. And at the end of chapter 3 in the book of Ruth, in verse 18, Naomi says, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man, referring to Boaz, will not rest until the matter is settled today. Naomi, at least now, is speaking as a woman of faith. And she says to Ruth, let's wait and see what God will do. Let's cast ourselves upon him. He's the Savior, not your banker. Ruth and Naomi were in a dilemma. It appeared that they would be virtual slaves of their social system for life. Without a miracle, they were without hope. And we know what that's like. Some of you are without hope today. Let's think about that. What does it mean to live without hope? We often want to live in the future, but today we need to live in the now. And how do we do that? It's when we believe that our joy, our strength is in the God of Jacob. And it says in Psalm 146, verse 5, that happy is he whose help is in the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God. But Ruth and Naomi were also in another dilemma, a dilemma that some of you are in today. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any resources. And that's a big reason why we panic. Now, I'm not advocating that you and I just sit in our lounge chair and wait for money to fall from the tree. But I do want to say that God's words say that my God will supply all your need according to his glorious riches in Christ Jesus. I know we don't want to say it here, but God does do miracles. And here are some thoughts about money. Maybe you and I would have more money in our pocket today if we didn't spend so much on the wrong stuff. I believe money is a sacred trust. But there's also a huge freedom that comes when you say, Lord, I'm going to give to you first. I can't think of how many people have said to me, Mike, would you pray for me that I'll win the lottery? And if I win the lottery, then I'll give you some money. And I kind of smile at that rhetoric because it speaks often of what is so close in our own heart that we don't want to admit. John, I see you smiling as I'm going through. Are you holding back here on something?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it so true, right? I will, if I can get this sorted out, I'll be able to help you. That's part of what we're talking about.
We're living in the future. We need to live in the now.
Absolutely. So it'll come right tomorrow, then I'll help you. But I'm smiling but the reality is I'm going to miss this moment.
Well, and the other thing that happens when we panic is that we lose out on joy. And not only does situations want to steal our joy, Satan wants to steal our joy. And he wants to lead us in a path of disobedience. That happened way back in the garden when he said to Eve, he said, if you eat of this fruit, then you will be like God. But what he was really doing was trying to steal away the joy that she knew of simply trusting in God as her creator and friend and saying, Lord, I'm going to live your way. And you see, for about 10 years, Naomi had been living in disobedience. Now, I know that her husband said we're going to go to Moab, but she had a choice as well. And she went through death, famine, loneliness, discouragement, you name it. She went through way more than I ever want to sign up for. But I believe there was a reason. She was living outside the will of God. And when you live outside the will of God, joy is missing. You see, you can have joy even in the midst of sorrow as you trust God through dark times. But it's another thing to be a child of God who chooses to live in disobedience and to go through hard times. We all know that trials will come, but God is faithful. He'll be there. But to be his child and disobeying him when a trial comes, I would never know if it was because it was just a problem or if God was getting my attention. So what I do in my own life is I go to the Lord and say, Lord, if I've sinned, if there's something wrong, please reveal that to me and forgive me. I want to walk with you, so that even if I'm walking through those experiences that we just referred to as our own personal living hell, I know that God is with me, because I believe that he gives grace for the place. And Paul often talked about the strength to endure and to persevere. But we need miracles. And when our back is up against the wall, we want to know about the capability of the one who has promised to help. And the beautiful part of the last chapter of the book of Ruth is that we hear about a person who's called the kinsman redeemer. Kinsman redeemer was a close relative who'd assumed financial and marital obligations towards the widowed relative that he'd married. And what we find here is that there was a kinsman redeemer other than Boaz who was a closer relative. And Boaz knows that there's another possibility for someone to redeem or take care of Ruth and Naomi. But whether or not he would redeem those two women was another question. I know his reasons seem justifiable. There wouldn't be enough to go around. But when the fellow hears that there is land involved, he's quite interested. But then suddenly he backs off, because initially he's thinking, more land, I can plant more crops, receive a bigger return on my money, borrow against the capital. But the mood changes when he hears there are people involved. We read in verse 5 that Boaz says, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you get the dead man's widow. And he thinks to himself, I don't think so. I don't want all of that. And what happened? His good intentions went by the wayside when he realized what was involved. And we need to be careful if we think about an application about who we look to redeem us, to get us out of our mess. Well, the second kinsman redeemer is Boaz, and he had both the desire and ability to redeem Ruth and Naomi. And he's different. Not only is he able to provide for Ruth and Naomi, but he's willing. And it's a beautiful story of someone who'd been rejected, Ruth and Naomi. And we all know what it's like in some ways to be unwanted. And some of you listening today know it in a profound way. Yet in the end, to experience redemption, to feel a sense of worth and being wanted back, becomes a beautiful picture. And Boaz becomes a powerful picture of what Jesus wants to do in your life and my life today, because it says he's died on the cross to forgive us for our sins, and so that we can walk and experience God's grace and his love in our lives. And more than money, more than a good luck rabbit's foot, Jesus is the one who has conquered death. And he's far better than any other redeemer. We need to be careful who we trust in, when what you need is to trust in Jesus. Be careful who you place your hope in. And when you need the hope of the Lord, know that he will be there to provide you with his strength and his joy. And that's why the essence of the book of Ruth is simply this. While we don't know what it's going to look like in the end, happily ever after can begin right now when we give our mess to the Master, because he wants to give you his grace for the place. And in just a moment, we're going to come right back with John and Ashley, and we're going to unpack what this looks like in your life, because you're probably wondering, is this true? Is God really able to be more than enough for the situation I'm in? Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Find the Way. I'm here with Dr. John Radford from Transpectives, transpectives.com, if you want to find him online. Great to have you back in the studio.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit, John, on this whole topic of happily ever after. We just heard from Mike and some thoughts on Ruth and what happened in her life. So what do you think? You work in the area of conflict. How does that tension of everything should be happily ever after play out in the work that you see?
Well, if you think about when we're in conflict, what happens typically is that my plan of how it could be is not working. And often what we do when it's not working is I begin to wonder, first of all, why is this not working? And I start to look to why. And often that's blame. I could be blaming you. I could sometimes blame myself around how did I get myself into this situation? But I start to look to my circumstance. In that, often we're in conflict. And I find when I'm working with people in conflict, particularly if the conflict has gone on for some time, what we tend to do is almost kind of set it aside. Although it's impacting us, I try and set it aside. So often we don't face it. Or I face it by putting it on you, not my part in it. And so part of what I find in my conflict work, part of it is actually helping people just to find hope. And so often people don't connect that to conflict, but it is to trust there could be another future in this situation.
John, you've said somewhere that a lot of times in conflict we want to blame someone else. Talk about that and that tension. When do we take responsibility?
So we do, because let's think about it. I have a plan, and it doesn't have to be an explicit plan. I have a way where I think this is going to work, whether it be a relationship, be it my family, be it my work, be it my life. It's going to kind of work like this. And then it doesn't. And it seems to get complicated. It seems to be not working the way I planned it to so. And in that process, I begin to say, well, what is this? And I start to look to you. I look to others. I look to my circumstances, to what happened. In that, there's a tension between the reality that I'm in and the possibility, the happily ever after, right, in that situation. What we often do by blaming others is we take the tension away from myself. So by putting it on you, I'm not really holding that myself. And part of, I think, what the story of Ruth, which is so beautiful, is that she's showing how she actually does hold that. She actually uses it. And she holds that tension about the reality of what really is and the hope for what it could be.
How can we actually, though, get to that place where we can hold the tension? Because that's something in and of itself, to be able to say, this is really what's going on, but I still have a hope.
And I think there's almost the impossibility of it, right? It does seem impossible. And so, Mike, as you were sharing, it comes down to trust. Often the situations I find myself that are most difficult, I feel like I can't trust. Something's happened and trust is broken. So often it might go together.
We almost become paralyzed, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And so we become stuck. We can become paralyzed in that situation. And I think what you're sharing this morning, right, Mike, from God's Word, is that, no, in that moment, if we can trust God, and we're trusting God with that tension. So we're inviting God into the tension. I'm not pushing it away. I'm not living in this dreamland future or getting smothered or being drowned almost in in what's happening in the reality. I'm living in that tension of the hope of what could be, but I'm asking God into it.
You and your wife, Lorraine, went to visit a person who is dying. Tell us that story.
Yeah, a really good friend, Dietmar. And I remember as we were going into him, and a wonderful man, healthy. This was not the plan. And he died within 2 months of being diagnosed with cancer. And I remember going to visit him and saying to Lorraine, I wonder how we're going to talk. What are we going to do? Because with someone else dying, we also face our own mortality in that sense. And we didn't come to a conclusion to that. But as we walked in, and here's the beauty. He was an example of Ruth, right? Where as we walked in, Diet said to us, have a seat. And he said, let's be clear, I'm not going to be here for Thanksgiving. I'm not going to be here. So let's not pretend I'm not dying. I am dying. This is such a beautiful time together. Let's use it. And we had a great conversation. We spoke about death. We spoke about life. So he and there's the beauty of it. By living in the tension, we actually can deal with what's really happening rather than disengage from it.
And what your friend had, too, in the midst of it is the hope, right?
Yes.
The hope, what we talked about in Ruth with Boaz being redeemed, that example of the greatest redemption, which is Jesus. And if we live out of something that's greater, that's when we can hold the tension.
Yes.
The not now.
And I think we fool ourselves if we think that we're going to be able to sort it all out and figure it all out, because if we could do that, we wouldn't need to trust in Jesus, would we?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and we kind of fool ourselves that we can sort it all out, and yet we can't. And so this is not a maybe this might happen. This is life. It's the reality of living this life of ours. And if we can face that, going back to what you were saying, actually, if we can actually face it, and in that moment bring God into it, we can actually engage in a much more powerful way, rather than denying the reality or living in this perhaps even false dream at this point.
You know, as we talk about living in the now, I think a very interesting experience was in the initial days coming out of the Fort McMurray fire. People started to talk about all the good and beautiful things that they were seeing, as people were far more congenial, caring, helping, supporting. There's always the few, stories that kind of color it, but there was still many beautiful things that were happening. And I have seen over and over that it's in the midst of difficulties and pain where people have experienced the power of Christ in their lives, the transformation happens, and that's where it seems the real story is as they live in the now.
So part of what happens then is, how do I know I'm actually trusting God in that moment? How do I know?
How do you know?
To me, it's quite simple. Because I'm not focused on me, I'm focused on you. I'm reaching out. So even my friend Dietmar, he reached out to us, right? So we wanted to reach out to him. He's dying, but he reaches out to us. And in that moment, there it is. Because when I reach out, then I know I'm having to trust in God. I'm trusting in much more than who I am. But I'm meeting you where you're at.
You know, Ruth had a great-great-grandson. His name was David. And he wrote a psalm that says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me.
Yes.
I wonder how much was framed by the story in his mind of Ruth when he thought about her whole story, the ups and downs and the valleys that she had gone through. I'm just thinking out loud, because different things shape us and frame us, don't they?
Absolutely.
As we go through that.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you think about it, we are shaped and framed not when we're on top of the mountain, but when we're in the valleys. It's what we do when we're under that pressure. When you said right at the beginning, Mike, and what you were talking about, when we're backs against the wall, right? And what do I do now? That's when my character is shaped.
Viktor Frankl had some experiences, didn't he? Out of World War II.
Yeah.
You had one there.
Viktor Frankl, one of my favorite psychologists, right? He survived the concentration camps. And one of the things he found while he was there, and he wrote about it and spoke about it afterwards, he actually could picture that too, was that the people who survived, it's so interesting, those who lived in a dream world did not face the reality, most likely died because they didn't care for their bodies even, right? And you had to survive each day, literally. Those who lived just in that moment, or just in the past, or what was happening, or this is a terrible situation, also died because they lost hope. Those who held the tension of just what it could be and the reality were those that if you were given the chance, many people didn't have that chance, but if they were given the chance to survive, did survive.
Wow. So, John, if you were to take all of this and we were to summarize it for people, what are some of just the main points that you would say?
So when we're faced with the plan that doesn't work, the not happy ever after, right? Face it. Face that reality, but in the hope of what could be. For that to be a reality, we've got to trust God. And trusting God, I know I'm trusting God when I'm actually now focused not just on me, but on you.
You've been listening to us on Find the Way. Once again, find us online at findtheway.faith. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, John, for being here, and Mike for your inspirational talk. We'll see you again next week.
And Ashley, we want to thank you for being here as well. And if you are listening today and want to know about what it means to trust God, write to us at findtheway.faith. We'll be glad to help you.